Our next speaker is Sharad Goel, who's an assistant professor in management science and engineering at Stanford University. His primary area of research is computational social science, an emerging discipline at the intersection of computer science, statistics, and social sciences. He's doing very exciting work that you'll hear about on simple rules and other strategies for making decisions in law enforcement. And you'll see that he applies modern computational and statistical techniques to understand and improve public policy.
Thanks for the introduction, Jen. So I'm just going to briefly comment on algorithmic fairness, which is an issue that's coming up a lot when we think about risk assessment tools. So I'm going to put this in the context of pretrial risk assessments. So this is a complement to what we just heard. And to the pretrial, just to make sure we're all on the same page, defendant or an individual is arrested. Usually within 24 hours, they appear before a judge who has to make this high-impact decision on whether or not to detain that individual pending trial. If they decide to set bail, if they decide to detain the individual, then there's huge social and even financial cost to that decision. At the same time, there's a state incentive to make sure that people show up to their trial, that they don't commit violent crimes when they're out, when they're pending trial. So we see that these algorithms, so the status quo is having humans make these types of decisions unaided by algorithms. We see that algorithms can significantly improve these decisions in the sense of significantly reducing the burden on defendants at the same time without increasing the risk to society. But one worry is that these algorithms are biased in this general sense, and now we have to understand what does this idea mean that the algorithms are biased. So there are at least a few different definitions of this. Perhaps the one that comes first to mind is that the algorithm is more likely to deem black defendants high risk than white defendants high risk. And so here's one statistic. We looked at Broward County data in Florida, building on the work that ProPublica did. And these are real numbers. So the proportion of black defendants that are deemed high risk of committing a violent crime under the algorithm is about 37%. It's about 18% of white defendants are deemed high risk of committing a violent crime under the algorithm. Now, I think this is a stark disparity. At the same time, there's a I would say, understandable explanation of what's going on here, that in Broward County at least, black defendants on average are higher risk, and so those disparities are reflected by these numbers. Now, a second definition of fairness is that the error rates across different groups should be comparable. So when we make mistakes for black defendants, they should happen roughly at the same rate as when we make mistakes for white defendants. Now, it turns out, again, looking at the Broward County data, this is not true. So here's one particular metric that has been reported looking at false positive rates. So just to dissect this a little bit, this means that among black and white defendants who ultimately don't go on to commit a violent crime, and remember that is what the algorithm is trying to predict, the proportion of black defendants who are deemed high risk by the algorithm is significantly bigger, about twice as big as the proportion of white defendants, again, who don't go on to commit a crime, who are deemed high risk. Now, when that determination by the algorithm was made, these defendants who ultimately did not commit these crimes are treated more harshly by the criminal justice system, and so we feel like these are inherently bad disparities. Now, what's interesting is that the same sort of issue that comes in this first statistic, that there are different detention rates for black and white defendants, the same sort of thing is happening here. That an algorithm that treats all defendants to the same standard, that holds all defendants to the same standard, and saying that we're going to detain a defendant if and only if they're at least 20% likely to commit a violent crime. If we apply that very simple type of rule that many people would consider as a fair rule, that we're naturally going to see this type of disparity. And so applying what I'm calling this equal treatment rule, where we apply the exact same standard to all defendants, will necessarily lead to disparity. Now, this disparity I want to highlight is not the same thing as discrimination, but it's a disparity nonetheless. And so now we have a few options moving forward, understanding that the natural, what many people would call the fair algorithm, will lead to this disparity. The first is that we stop using algorithms. Now, I think this is something that many jurisdictions are considering, at least slowing the adoption of algorithms. I would caution against this because humans are doing the exact same thing. So a human that applies these types of structured decision rules, applying the exact same standard to every defendant, are going to lead to these exact same disparities. And worse, judges are are trying to make the same risk assessments that algorithms are doing, but are typically worse at it. We see that this is the case. For example, in one large jurisdiction, we find that we can likely release we can detain half as many defendants with little risk of increasing harms to society. So moving to algorithms usually has significant benefits over human decision makers alone. Our second option is that we force our algorithms to maintain these types of, to eliminate these types of disparities I just talked about. For example, we'll force the algorithm to detain the same number of white and black defendants. We'll force the algorithm to have the exact same error rates for white and black defendants. Now, it turns out that really the only way to accomplish this is to set two different thresholds, one for black defendants and one for white defendants. Now we can do that, and if we've decided as a society that we don't want to have these disparities for whatever reason, then this is an option that's on the table. However, it almost certainly violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. So we have to understand the limitations of this type of solution. So even if it's a policy choice that we might want, it's almost certainly not going to happen. So the third is that we use algorithms with care. And I think really this is all we can do. And let me just make this a little bit more specific. Algorithms are good at what they're good at, and they're bad at everything else. And they're good at estimating risk. This is where they beat humans, but they don't set policy. They don't tell us if we should move away from money bail. Many jurisdictions are doing this. They don't tell us what exactly the threshold should be. And they don't tell us how to bolster pre-style services, how to build out infrastructure. So we have to we have to understand the power of algorithms, and we also have to understand their limitations. So I'll end with that. Thanks, and here are a few references if you want to read more about this.